On her 68th birthday, Margaret Collins heard the one sentence she never expected from her own son. Daniel Collins stood in her doorway that evening in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, his hands still in his coat pockets, his expression carefully neutral as he said he would not be joining her for dinner. The words were simple, almost polite on the surface, but they landed in the room like something heavier than either of them wanted to admit. Margaret had spent the entire day preparing as she always did, setting the dining table with the same white ceramic plates she had used for decades, placing a small cake she baked herself in the center of the table, and arranging 2 extra chairs even though she had quietly hoped she would need all 3. The house smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes, a meal she had measured carefully, even adjusting the seasoning twice to make sure everything was perfect. She had even driven 5 miles that morning just to pick up fresh flowers from a local grocery store, insisting on sunflowers because Daniel used to say they made the kitchen feel warm. But now he stood there, avoiding the dining room entirely, as if entering it would make the moment more real than he could handle. Margaret asked him gently if something had changed, her voice steady but soft, and Daniel hesitated before repeating that he simply could not stay. He did not raise his voice, and he did not look angry, which somehow made the distance between them feel even wider. Behind him, parked at the curb, was his black sedan still running, and inside the car sat Laura Collins, his wife of 12 years, scrolling through her phone as if she were waiting for something far less significant than a family dinner. Margaret noticed her only briefly through the window, but that brief glance was enough to tighten something in her chest that she could not name. She had always tried to be patient with Laura, always telling herself that younger generations simply expressed love differently. But tonight there was no gesture of apology, no attempt to soften the moment, only silence stretching between all 3 of them like an invisible wall. Daniel finally said he would call her tomorrow to make it up to her, but even as he said it, there was a hesitation in his tone that suggested he knew the promise would not mean the same thing it once did. Margaret nodded slowly, as though accepting something she did not fully understand yet, and stepped aside as he turned to leave. She watched him walk down the path toward the car, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, steadying herself in a way she had not needed to do years ago. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the sound seemed to echo through the quiet house more than she expected. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to the faint sound of tires on gravel as the car pulled away, leaving her birthday dinner untouched behind her. Then she turned back toward the dining room, where the candles on the table were still burning steadily, unaware that no one would be sitting down to them tonight. Margaret Collins remained standing in the doorway long after the sound of the car faded into the quiet suburban evening. The house felt larger now, not because anything had changed in its structure, but because the absence inside it had grown heavier. She slowly walked back toward the dining room, her steps unhurried, almost careful, as if rushing might disturb something fragile in the air. The table she had prepared earlier still looked perfect under the warm light of the hanging fixture above it. 2 plates remained untouched, and the 3rd plate, set for Daniel, sat exactly where she had placed it earlier that morning, now feeling like a decision that had not been honored. She sat down slowly at the edge of the chair, placing her hands together in her lap, looking at the meal she had prepared with such quiet hope. The food was still warm enough to eat, but her appetite had disappeared without her noticing when it left. Instead, she found herself listening to the silence of the room, noticing how it seemed to press against every surface in a way that made even the smallest sound feel amplified. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly, and the candles on the table flickered slightly as if uncertain whether they should continue burning. Margaret thought about how Daniel had stood in the doorway earlier, the way he had avoided looking directly at the table, and how carefully he had chosen his words. It was not anger she had seen in him, and it was not sadness either. It was something more distant, something that made her feel as though she was no longer part of the same space he occupied emotionally. She reached over and adjusted one of the plates, aligning it with precision, not because it was necessary, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. Outside, the street lights began to turn on one by one along the quiet road, casting a soft glow through the window curtains. Margaret remembered birthdays from years ago when Daniel was still a child, when he would run into the kitchen before breakfast just to ask what time the cake would be ready. She remembered how the house used to feel louder then, filled with movement, conversation, and small moments that seemed ordinary at the time but now felt like something distant and unreachable. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, allowing herself to sit fully in the present rather than the memory. The phone on the counter remained silent, untouched since Daniel left. She did not move to check it. Instead, she looked at the empty chair across from her and tried to understand when exactly dinner stopped being something shared and became something that could be declined without consequence. The question lingered without an answer, settling into the room alongside the fading warmth of the food she had prepared. Margaret Collins remained seated at the dining table long after the house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, but nothing about the evening felt usual anymore. The untouched plate still sat in front of her, now cooled and dim under the fading candlelight. She slowly pushed one plate slightly forward, then stopped, as if even that small movement required more effort than she wanted to admit. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the front door, and she found herself replaying the moment Daniel had stood there earlier, his voice calm but distant, as though he had already stepped out of the conversation before it even began. It was not just the refusal to stay for dinner that lingered in her thoughts, but the way he had avoided her gaze, the way his answers had felt prepared in advance, as if he had rehearsed how to leave without making it sound like leaving. Margaret rose from the chair and began clearing the table slowly, stacking plates with careful precision, not because she needed to finish the task, but because staying still felt heavier than moving. As she carried the dishes into the kitchen, she noticed how quiet the house had become without even the smallest trace of recent conversation. The silence felt structured, almost intentional, as though every sound had been removed one by one until only emptiness remained. She placed the dishes into the sink and turned on the water, letting it run over her hands longer than necessary, staring at the way it carried away traces of the meal she had prepared for a dinner that never happened. As she dried her hands, her thoughts drifted back to the past few months, moments she had previously dismissed but now began to see differently. There had been canceled visits that were never rescheduled, short phone calls that ended sooner each time, and polite explanations that always sounded reasonable on the surface but left her feeling increasingly outside of her son's daily life. She remembered asking Daniel once about coming over for a simple Sunday lunch, and how he had responded with vague uncertainty, mentioning work and timing and responsibilities without ever offering a clear alternative. At the time, she had accepted it without question, telling herself that adult lives became complicated, but now those small moments felt connected in a way she had not understood before. She returned to the dining room and stood near the table again, looking at the empty chair where Daniel had not sat. Her expression remained calm, but something inside her had begun to shift, not in anger or sadness, but in recognition. It was as if she was beginning to see a pattern that had always been present but never fully visible when she was standing too close to it. She sat down again, this time not reaching for anything, simply observing the stillness around her. The house outside remained unchanged, the neighborhood light steady through the window, yet inside, something no longer felt aligned in the way it once had. She folded her hands together and rested them on the table, her gaze steady and focused, as though she was no longer waiting for the evening to resolve itself, but instead beginning to understand that it already had in a way she had not expected. Margaret Collins remained seated at the dining table long after the quiet of the house had fully settled around her. But her mind was no longer resting in the same silence. The empty chair across from her had stopped feeling like a simple absence and had begun to feel like a question she had not thought to ask before. She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the hallway again. And this time the memory of Daniel standing in the doorway earlier returned with sharper detail. It was not only what he said, but how he stood. As if the act of entering her home required a kind of emotional distance she had not noticed before. Margaret slowly rose from the table and walked toward the living room, her steps unhurried, her expression steady, yet her thoughts becoming increasingly layered with moments she had once dismissed. She sat on the edge of the sofa and folded her hands together, and as she did, she began to recall the past year in fragments rather than as a continuous story. There were Sundays she had prepared meals that were later postponed, not canceled outright but gently moved to another date that never seemed to arrive. There were phone calls from Daniel that felt shorter each time, with pauses that lingered just long enough for her to notice but never long enough for her to question directly. She remembered one afternoon when she had suggested visiting a local farmer market together, only to hear Daniel respond that he would need to check schedules and get back to her. A response that had sounded reasonable at the time but now felt part of a pattern she was only beginning to recognize. Margaret stood again and walked slowly toward the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where everything appeared unchanged, neighbors' porch lights glowing softly, cars parked neatly in driveways, life continuing in its usual rhythm. Yet inside her, something had begun to separate itself from that rhythm, as though she was no longer fully aligned with the version of life she had believed she was part of. She thought about Laura, Daniel's wife, and how every interaction with her had been polite but carefully controlled, conversations that stayed within safe boundaries and never expanded into anything personal. At the time, Margaret had told herself that it was simply personality difference, but now she wondered whether distance had been introduced gradually, not in a single moment, but through repeated small decisions that slowly reshaped where she belonged in their lives. She returned to the dining room and placed her hand lightly on the back of Daniel's empty chair. Not sitting, just standing there as if acknowledging something unspoken. Her breathing remained calm, but her awareness had sharpened in a way that made the house feel different. Not unfamiliar, but no longer neutral. Felt observed now, as if she was beginning to see how many spaces she had filled in their lives without realizing how easily she could be removed from them. She sat down again, her posture straight, her eyes steady, and for the first time that evening she was no longer thinking about what had happened, but rather about what had been happening long before she noticed. Margaret Collins remained in the quiet living room long after the evening had settled into a deeper stillness, but her thoughts were no longer anchored to the present moment. She sat upright on the edge of the sofa, hands gently folded, her eyes fixed on the dim reflection of the window where the street outside blurred into soft light. The absence of Daniel had begun to reshape itself in her mind, not as a single act of refusal, but as something built slowly over time. She began to recall small details that had once seemed insignificant. The way Daniel had started speaking about his schedule in fragments rather than full explanations. The way he would pause slightly before confirming visits, as if checking something unseen before answering her. The way conversations that used to flow naturally had become shorter, more structured, as though there was a limit she could not see but was expected to stay within. Margaret stood and walked toward the kitchen again, but this time she did not focus on the dinner table or the remaining food. Instead, she opened a drawer and found an old notebook where she occasionally wrote reminders. She placed it on the counter and sat down, not to write anything immediately, but simply to look at the blank page as if it might help her organize thoughts that were no longer linear. The house remained silent, yet that silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by memories she had not previously questioned. She thought about Laura again, Daniel's wife, and how every interaction had always followed the same pattern of politeness without depth. Laura would smile, ask about general well-being, then quickly shift the conversation away from anything personal. At family gatherings, she often positioned herself between Daniel and Margaret without appearing to do so intentionally, always steering conversations toward neutral topics such as work or household matters. At the time, Margaret had interpreted it as social preference, but now she began to wonder whether it had served another purpose entirely. She leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, as she recalled how invitations to holidays and birthdays had become less certain over the past 2 years. Sometimes they were confirmed late, sometimes adjusted at the last moment, and sometimes simply not followed through without explanation. Each instance on its own had seemed reasonable, but together they began to form a structure she could no longer ignore. Margaret closed the notebook without writing anything and stood again, moving toward the dining room once more. The table was still set, though now the untouched meal felt like a record of expectations that had not been met. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table and looked across at the empty chair where Daniel had not sat. For a long moment she remained still, not reacting, not speaking, simply observing the space as though seeing it for the first time with clearer understanding. Something inside her had shifted from confusion to awareness, not loud or emotional, but steady and deliberate, like a realization forming its shape without needing permission to exist. Margaret Collins was still sitting at the dining table when the sound of a soft knock reached the front door, pulling her out of the quiet spiral of thoughts she had been sitting with for what felt like hours. She did not move immediately, as if unsure whether she was ready to re-enter a world that existed outside her reflection of recent memories. The knock came again, more gently this time, and she finally stood and walked down the hallway, her steps measured and calm. When she opened the door, she found Evelyn Hart standing there, a longtime neighbor who had lived 2 houses down for nearly 20 years. Evelyn held a small container in her hands, likely leftovers from her own dinner, but her expression shifted slightly when she saw Margaret's face. There was a brief pause between them, the kind that happens when someone notices something has changed, but is not yet certain how to name it. Evelyn asked if she was interrupting anything, and Margaret simply shook her head and stepped aside, allowing her in without explanation. They moved into the living room, and Evelyn placed the container on the kitchen counter before turning back, her eyes scanning Margaret carefully in a way that was subtle but attentive. She mentioned that she had seen Daniel's car earlier in the evening but noticed it had not stayed long, and Margaret responded with a simple acknowledgement without offering detail. There was another pause before Evelyn sat down slowly, adjusting her hands in her lap, as though deciding whether to speak or remain silent. After a moment, she began to talk about casual things at first: the weather, a local store closing earlier than expected, small pieces of everyday life that usually filled conversations between neighbors. But then her tone shifted slightly, becoming more careful, and she mentioned that she had seen Laura a few days earlier speaking on the phone outside her car with what looked like printed schedules in her hand. Evelyn hesitated before continuing, explaining that it was not her intention to intrude, but she had overheard enough to notice that several dates were being discussed, including family visits and dinners that had been rearranged more than once. According to her, Laura seemed to be organizing everything with precise control, confirming times and then adjusting them again while referencing Daniel's availability rather than Margaret's invitations. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression steady, but her hands resting more firmly on her knees as the information settled into her awareness. She did not react outwardly, but something inside her aligned with what she had already begun to sense earlier that evening. Evelyn quickly added that she might be misunderstanding things and did not want to assume anything unfair, but Margaret simply nodded, acknowledging her words without disagreement or reassurance. After a few more minutes of quiet conversation, Evelyn stood and said she should head home, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's arm before leaving. When the door closed again, the house returned to silence, but it no longer felt like the same silence as before. Margaret stood in the center of the room, her gaze moving slowly from one familiar object to another, as though seeing them through a different awareness. The information she had just heard did not create shock, but instead confirmed something she had already begun to recognize on her own. She walked back toward the dining table, where everything remained unchanged from earlier, yet now felt part of a larger pattern she could no longer ignore. Sitting down once more, she looked at the empty chair across from her, and allowed herself to fully accept that what she had once believed to be distance might have been carefully arranged space. And in that quiet realization, her thoughts no longer stayed with confusion, but began to settle into something more focused and deliberate. Margaret Collins remained seated at the dining table even after Evelyn Hart had left, but the presence of that conversation still lingered in the room like an echo that had not yet faded. The house was quiet again, yet it no longer felt like the same kind of quiet she had experienced earlier that evening. Now it felt structured, as if every silence had meaning attached to it. She slowly stood and walked toward the kitchen, not with urgency, but with a steady, controlled pace, and opened the cabinet where she kept her personal files. Inside were folders she had not touched in months, mostly household documents, insurance papers, and old correspondence that had accumulated over the years without much thought. She placed one folder on the counter and opened it, scanning pages without immediately searching for anything specific. Her expression remained calm, but her focus had sharpened in a way that suggested she was no longer observing events as separate moments, but as connected pieces of something larger. As she reviewed the documents, her mind returned to conversations with Daniel over the past year. Not individually dramatic moments, but small structural changes in how information had been shared with her. She remembered being told that certain paperwork had already been handled, that certain appointments were unnecessary for her to attend, and that certain decisions were already coordinated. At the time, she had accepted these explanations without resistance, trusting that her role in the family had simply shifted toward observation rather than participation. Now, those same moments appeared differently, not as convenience, but as removal from decision-making. She closed the folder and leaned against the counter for a moment, her eyes fixed on the kitchen window where the night outside remained still and undisturbed. The reflection in the glass showed a woman who looked composed, but internally, her awareness had become increasingly precise. She began to understand that the changes she had felt were not sudden, but gradual adjustments made over time, small enough individually to be dismissed, yet consistent enough to form a pattern. She walked back toward the dining room and paused beside the table again, looking at the empty chair where Daniel had once been seated earlier in the evening. The memory no longer carried emotional confusion, only clarity. She now saw that his distance had not appeared all at once during this birthday, but had been built through repeated recalibration of presence, timing, and priority. Margaret pulled the chair out slightly and sat down, not in expectation, but in observation. Her hands rested calmly on the table, and her gaze remained steady. For the first time that night, she was no longer trying to understand what had happened in isolation. Instead, she was beginning to understand how long it had been happening without being seen. Margaret Collins remained seated at the dining table as the night deepened, but her attention was no longer tied to the physical space around her in the same way it had been earlier. The empty chair across from her still stood in place, yet it no longer represented confusion or absence, but something far more defined in her mind. She looked at it with a steady, composed expression, as if she were no longer trying to interpret what had happened that evening, but instead placing it into a larger framework that had been forming quietly over time. The house remained silent, but she no longer experienced that silence as emptiness. It now felt like distance that had been carefully constructed, not by a single moment, but through repeated decisions that had slowly changed her position within her own family. She stood and walked toward the kitchen again, her movements calm and deliberate, and paused near the counter where her personal documents had been left earlier. Instead of reopening the folder, she simply placed her hand on it for a moment, as if acknowledging its existence without needing to continue searching immediately. Her thoughts were no longer scattered between emotion and reaction. Instead, they had begun to organize themselves into patterns that felt unmistakably consistent. She thought about Daniel again, not as the son who had once filled her home with noise and presence, but as the man who now moved through his life with increasing separation from her. She began to recognize that the shift she had felt was not sudden rejection, but gradual repositioning, where her involvement had been slowly reduced without confrontation. Each canceled visit, each shortened call, each decision made without her input now aligned into a structure she could no longer ignore. Margaret returned to the dining room and stood beside the table once more, looking down at the untouched place setting that had been meant for Daniel. The food was no longer relevant. The celebration was no longer relevant. What remained was the realization that her role had been adjusted long before she had been informed of it, and only now was she beginning to see the full shape of that adjustment. She pulled the chair slightly back and sat down again, not with expectation, but with clarity. Her posture remained straight, her hands resting calmly on the table, and her gaze fixed forward. There was no visible emotion of distress, only a quiet acceptance that something fundamental in her understanding had changed. She was no longer interpreting the evening as a single act of absence, but as evidence of a longer process that had been unfolding without her awareness. Outside, the neighborhood remained unchanged, lights steady and distant, life continuing in a rhythm that did not reflect the shift occurring within her. Inside the house, however, Margaret was no longer positioned within uncertainty. She was observing from a place of understanding that had been reached not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. And in that stillness, she remained seated, no longer waiting for anything to return to how it was, but fully aware that it never had been what she believed it to be. Margaret Collins remained seated at the dining table as the night reached its deepest quiet, but something within her had already moved beyond the stillness of the room. The empty chair across from her no longer represented absence or disappointment. It had become a fixed point of understanding, something she could look at without confusion or emotional reach. She slowly rose from her seat and began clearing the table, not with urgency, but with a steady sense of completion, as if the act itself had shifted from routine to acknowledgement. Each plate she picked up felt lighter than before, not because anything had changed physically, but because her interpretation of the evening had changed completely. When she entered the kitchen, she set the dishes down and turned on the light above the counter, letting it fill the space with a soft brightness that contrasted with the darkness outside. For a moment, she simply stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. Her gaze lowered as she processed not what had happened tonight, but what had been unfolding long before tonight ever arrived. She thought again about Daniel, about the way his presence in her life had slowly changed shape over time, not through confrontation, but through quiet redirection. It was no longer a question of a single refusal or a single missed dinner. It was a pattern of distance that had been built in small increments, each one easy to justify alone, but impossible to ignore when seen together. She opened the drawer where she kept her personal notes and retrieved the same notebook she had looked at earlier. This time, she did not leave it blank. She wrote slowly, carefully, not emotional words, but factual observations, date, moment, and brief descriptions of conversations that now carried a different meaning than they had at the time. As she wrote, her expression remained calm, almost neutral, but her focus was absolute. When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, not as something hidden, but as something defined. She returned to the dining room and stood beside the table once more, looking at the empty place setting that had marked the beginning of the evening. The candles had long burned down, leaving only faint traces of wax on the table's surface. She did not attempt to relight them or restore anything to how it had been earlier. Instead, she adjusted the chair slightly, aligning it neatly with the table. Not as an act of hope, but as an act of closure. She stood there for a long moment, then slowly moved toward the hallway, turning off the lights one by one as she walked through the house. Each switch clicked softly, marking the transition from one state of awareness to another. When she finally reached her bedroom, she paused at the doorway, looking back once at the quiet home she had lived in for decades. Nothing about it had changed externally, but everything within her understanding of it had shifted. She entered the room, closed the door gently behind her, and for the first time that evening, she was no longer thinking about what she had lost, but about what she now clearly understood had been happening all along.